That was a really nice introduction. So, physically, distance is just the space between 2 points. But to me, it is a psychological buffer that allows you to understand and care about something without ever actually truly feeling its weight. Um, it's a strange phenomenon, isn't it? How can we be aware of a global crisis? Yet, it doesn't actually affect the way we eat our dinner or how we sleep at night. I thought that I was a good person because I had acknowledged the fact. But I've since then wondered, how can I be so informed, yet I can still remain so comfortable? Was I actually connected to its reality? Was I just living under a buffer, under a filter that I didn't even know existed? Growing up in Vietnam, we learned so much about stories and the tragedies of Agent Orange. We learn about the casualties, the statistics, and the long term devastating consequences. We see maps like these with ink covering a length of our country. We recognize the 4.8 million people who were exposed, the 3 million victims, and millions more who lived in poverty because of it. But for a long time, these were just colors on a map. These were just numbers, statistics. They were just bars on a graph. For most, myself included, this information had created a baseline of sympathy, which I thought was enough to define it as care. Since then, I've discovered a term that resonates with what I was feeling. Rational compassion. So, what is rational compassion? Rational compassion is the practice of choosing to help others based on logic, moral principles, and objective needs. I cared because it had felt logical to do so, because caring was simply what a good person is supposed to do. It had allowed me to care without ever being emotionally burnt out. However, there is a distinct gap between actually knowing and encountering. Because my care had remained rational, I had also remained emotionally detached. Because this care I had was trapped in this mental space in which I could be informed without ever actually being impacted, and it had made me comfortable for a very long time. However, in 2024, I had the opportunity to visit care homes for people who were affected by this chemical, and that mental barrier had shattered completely. During then, I had the chance to visit care homes with my old school's community club. During that, we had a very packed schedule. We hosted quizzes, we set up painting stations, we even hosted games for like tug of war. But after all the chaos wound down and the music stopped, and I just found myself sitting alone on this wooden bench, just trying to catch my breath. And then I just started to watch. I watched how the sunlight hit the floor, and I watched her. She was an older person than me. I noticed her during the day. She wasn't really interested in any of our games, though. While we were trying to lead the room, she was just elsewhere. She was older than me, yes, but there was this childlike focus in her eyes as she moved. And when she sat beside me, she just reached over and started carefully braiding my hair. For context, though, she didn't just suddenly braid my hair. She had been going from person to person, braiding hair with this careful patience. Back then, my hair was cut in layers, so it was really messy and uneven. However, she was patient. I could feel the roughness of her fingertips, trying to lift the strands by strands through those messy layers of hair, and eventually making this beautiful braid. And then, after everything was done, she just lay beside me, took my phone, and took a selfie, and even kissing my cheeks in the process the photo was taken. At that moment, it had changes into this phenomenological encounter. It was the tactile reality of her hands and her smile. And her smile was what had made me realize how small my perspectives were. That photo, that selfie, is still in my camera roll today. But there was a point of time where I actually felt really uncomfortable trying to look back at it. It had affected me because it had essentially killed my comfort. Now, when I see that graph again, I don't just see a statistic, I don't just see numbers anymore. The data, it had become rather noisy, it was loud, it was physical, and it had become a person, and an actual person that I had the chance to meet. From then, I actually realized that this so called rational compassion that I had was actually just this sophisticated way for me to just remain selfish. Psychologists call this the control level theory. It suggests that when you are distant from an event, you focus on the concepts. And for me, it was the history, it was the casualties, it was the statistics. But when I actually started to look closer, it had been the small details. It was the roughness of her fingertips. It was the pulling of my hair. And it was the sounds of her laugh. What I'm trying to say here is proximity doesn't just give us more information, it fundamentally changes what you know. And I had soon realized that my thoughts were much similar to those messy layers of hair. They were tangled, they were divergent, they were fragmented. I had spent these past few years trying to gather those strands of information, but without any pulling or tension. Those strands had remained loose and frayed. It was thanks to her patient hands that had guided those strands into a beautiful braid, and it had shaped the person that I am today. In the end, I want to say that this talk I have and this experience I had wasn't a moral awakening, but rather a cognitive shift. It was when I had realized that truth only stops holding weight and starts holding weight when you start looking at it from a distance. Thank you.